This is an image of the primordial couple in Chinese history, Fuxi and Nu Gua. And it appears in Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China, Volume 1, Introductory Orientations. It was published in 1954, and it was the first time that anyone has ever essayed to discover the role of science in Chinese history. It had never been done. And by 2004, 50 years later, it's now about 20 volumes, very huge, $200 or $300 each volume, and soon to be finished at about 25 volumes. Needham was very refined. He was a tough old cigar-smoking, toughy, intellectual engineer from the 30s who went to China and discovered that there were all sorts of things that the Chinese themselves didn't read and were available. And so at Cambridge University in England, he set up a whole organization in Keyes College. And he became the master of Gonville Keyes College at Cambridge and became one of the greatest figures in world history and history of science. Extraordinary. But also one of those persons who was able to go back to something fundamental. In one of the volumes, he has a photograph he himself took of Huineg. Huineg was the sixth patriarch of Zen Buddhism. He lived in the 600s AD, and he was such a yogic master that when he died, he ossified his body so that it became petrified like anthracite coal, and the body is still there in this hidden away Taoist temple. And Needham, the engineer from Cambridge University, himself took the photograph so that he understood there's something about the vastness of civilization that is only healthy as long as it's able to go back and recontact its primordial roots. That civilized life, for its stability, needs to maintain some access to the wilderness. And so we're using Thoreau and the I Ching because these are two exemplars, one consistent throughout Chinese civilization, and the other the epitome of the Western civilization that always was able to go back to its wilderness primordiality. In our education, we're going to find many examples of this, many resonances of this, and finally establish the waveform harmonic that this frequency holds for us, because we're involved now in a completely new scale of civilization, a civilization that's going to be the size of our star system. And it's going to take about 200 years for that to at least be established enough that it's there. But our generation are the pioneers. And we're pioneering in the sense that we have to establish that there are no roads. There are only Paleolithic animal trails which we are able to follow in such a way that we don't destroy those trails, so as to preserve the mystery of life, which will be essential to all of the persons living in this new civilization. As a part of our inquiry, we have presentations every week, and then 4 of those presentations amount to a square, and that square in terms of time is the same as a lunar cycle. It's a moon cycle, 4 weeks. So that in a way, the pace of this education, of this learning, of this inquiry, is a pace that was there in very ancient times In fact, times more ancient than ancient. We would call them today archaic times, and the name for that era is the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. And the Paleolithic lasted from before our species came into play in a major way. It was there in its rudiments for a species that was there before us, Homo neanderthal. But Homo sapiens sapiens, when we came in as a species about 120,000 years ago, the origins go back to almost 200,000 years. But about 120,000 years ago, there was a sudden explosion of our particular hominid species that followed in a trail that was set by a species that lived 2 million years before us, and that was Homo erectus. And Homo erectus, originating in Africa, in the great rift valleys of Africa, was the first species to be able to go outside completely of its environment, outside of the matrix of geography and circumstance, of nutritional cycle, of animal ecology, and to literally explore the world. And Homo erectus, 2 million years ago, we have a complete skeleton that Richard Leakey and several of his confreres found. Homo erectus, this exemplar, was a young African, about 18 years old, and he was almost 6 feet tall. He had an athletic build from his bones and would have been about as fast as an Olympic runner with incredible stamina. And Homo erectus went out of Africa, initially crossing the Red Sea down around where Aden is, the island of Socotra, onto the Arabic Peninsula, and along all the shores going east and going into the Middle East. And Homo erectus explored a great deal of the planet 2 million years ago. Our kind, when it came into play, followed in this very ancient way. Not a path so much, but it was a resonant set of possibilities that now received an extra transformation, an extra amperage to it. And what came out of our species in the Paleolithic was, for the very first time, a penetrating depth of conscious vision that resulted in art for the very first time. And while Homo neanderthal had some kinds of natural ceremonies, there was no art. And while Homo neanderthal was able to make certain sounds and probably had in its kind some kind of a rudimentary vocabulary, it wasn't until our species that this central thorax area of our skeleton and the development of the concomitant areas in the back of the cerebellum in the brain allowed for the very first time a refined breath control of more than 60 variations per second that allowed for human speech for the first time. So that language is born in a very real way with our species. And our species is a myth-making species. We report, we tell each other, we have the stories, we have the traditions, we have the cycles, we have the mythologies, which were not there before us and are indelible about us. That Paleolithic era for our species lasted from the beginnings, 200,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago, and it wasn't until about 40,000 years ago that art was born for the very first time. and where it was born were in caves. And one of the great writers on Paleolithic art, this was one of the last books he was able to do, André Leroy-Gourhan. This is translated by Claire Jacobson in the 1980s. He has done a whole lifetime of work with Paleolithic art, and he observes that one begins to find Paleolithic art in caves exactly at that threshold where natural light is last able to be discerned. And he says, we do not have to make something special out of this philosophically so much. It could just be that the artists wanted, if their lamp went out, if their torch went out, to be able to find their way out. But the fact is that in his own investigations, and later on in the book, he shows that there are great cycles in Paleolithic art. And one of the cycles is that it undergoes a morphing frequency where there is a rise in penetration into the cave, into the underground, back into not only just complete darkness, but into complex labyrinthian darkness. Caves that are like mazes. Caves with so many branches and enormous complexities. And at the depths of those caves, one finds the highest point of Paleolithic art. And through several waves of Paleolithic human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, through the Aurignacian, through the Salterian, through the Magdalenian, up until the end of the last glaciation. In wave after wave, Homo sapiens sapiens went through a cycle where they would reach an apex, and then that apex was brought back out into play again as if something secret had been found and was now brought back to be put into play in some of the original qualities. The last great cycle, the Magdalenian, began about 14,000 years ago. And at the beginnings, one finds again that Magdalenian art is there at that threshold where the last light of daylight could be seen. But as it deepened by about 10,000 years ago, one found that Magdalenian artists went further and further into the most dangerous, underground, spectacular sites, and there put their art. And then towards the end of the Magdalenian phase of the Paleolithic, the art comes back to the cave entrances, and about 8,000 BC, 7,000 BC, about 9,000 years ago, the originality of Paleolithic art evaporates, and one finds no new forms. So that some great cycle has occurred several times already, and by about 7,000 BC, one finds the beginnings of a whole new echelon of life, of a style of life called the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. Sometimes archaeologists will put a little wedge of Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age, in between, but it's really the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. And the great watershed is a comportment of life, because in the Paleolithic, our kind were hunters and gatherers and fisher people. We fished, we hunted, we gathered. An enormous change came in the Neolithic, because there our kind took to taming the animals, to taming the plants, and finally to taming ourselves. And so you have agricultural societies rather than hunter societies. Rather than going out to follow the animals, or to go out seasonally where the plants are, the animals and plants are brought under human taming control, and one begins to find animal husbandry and agricultural practices. And at the very same time, you find a new quality, less heroic, less artistic, less primordial than the Paleolithic. And when the Neolithic comes into play, it leads more and more to villages. In China, the ancient tradition was that there were always 8 families gathered around a central well. So it's like a tic-tac-toe game with the center square being the well, and the 8 families arranged around that well, and each one would have their own plot of land, but they would work together. And so the villages began in this way. And in the Chinese tradition, there's always the sense that there is a space in the middle that is not owned, but is shared. And that shared middle becomes eventually the seed for the sense of Tao. That there is a mysteriously distributed space that is shareable, not just by 8 families, but by all life, and not like the Force in Star Wars, but a non-force that allows for something to occur, and what occurs is existence. And so the ancient Paleolithic wisdom was to follow the animals, to follow the ways of the plants and the herbs, to follow the way of the fish and the marine life, and to participate in their nature. Whereas in the Neolithic, you have a transform of this, a pulling back, so that the participation is not in a primal way, but is in a secondary way. We find this in the development of the I Ching. The original taproot, Fuxi and Nugua, and they're always in ancient times, in Paleolithic style, they're always presented together. They're always presented with their dragon tails intertwined together like a double helix. They're the fruitful Paleolithic pair. And yet the date of Fuxi and Nugua is about 2950 BC, about 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago. And already at that time, one sees that the last traces of the Paleolithic in North China are transformed into the Neolithic. European experience is very similar. The Neolithic reached Western Europe about the same time, about 3000 BC. Though the origins of the Neolithic can go back several times that in time in the Zagros Mountains and some of the valleys in southern Iran, there are traces of the beginnings of agriculture back to about 9000 BC. In some parts of Thailand, northern Thailand, Myanmar, which used to be Burma, about the same time. In Jericho, on the Jordan River, one can find it goes back to about 8000 BC, 10,000 years ago. In Samaria, where you first begin to have these villages and communities enlarging so that one now has ceremonial centers that become like little nascent cities, not because they're cities, but because the royal entourage, the ceremonial entourage, the need to not only farm animals and plants and herbs and so forth, but to also commandeer the minerals and the metals and bring all these working things together. So you have the beginnings of cities which are necessary developments of the Neolithic. And so the Neolithic goes all the way through the development of villages and towns into patterns of villages and towns, and then all of a sudden there's a second huge change that happens. And that second huge change is that for the very first time, instead of the Paleolithic or the Neolithic, one begins to have what we call civilization. That a civilization now is a pattern of urban life that has shifted and changed and has become very refined, and it's no longer about even just being one remove from nature. Now it's about being two removes from nature, because while the Paleolithic was all about existence being still following in nature, and the Neolithic was all about the mythic culture ceremonially having some contact with it, civilization is symbolic. And it has the ability to be abstracted from nature, to be aligned just with the existential objectivity, linked by an experience, feeling-toned mythology, which is now summed up in the symbols, which is now brought together in essence in ideas. And so thought becomes the vehicle for the vibration of civilization, just as myth was the vibration for the Neolithic, and the existentiality of life was the vibration of the Paleolithic. And in all this, there's a progressive bringing together, an integration, an integral, and it's like a target. And when one gets to that bullseye where there are ideas of ideas, there are symbols controlling all symbols, there's a central synthesizing symbol, there's a central idea which is now able to be a doctrine or a principle or a set of principles that add up to a code, to a law. And all of a sudden you have the possibility of two things at once, and it's a great watershed. One either goes into a differential conscious art, or one goes back regressively into a super codified politic. You get a political economy run by law, run by codes, run by authority. You get an empire. And so civilizations come to a crisis where they either turn into an empire, where man is not just taming something and not just integrating something, but he is forcefully controlling in an authoritarian way everything, and seeks to extend his control all the way back to nature. We don't want these trees here. We're going to cut them down. We don't want these hills here. We're going to bulldoze them. These oceans are ours. These are sea lanes. We need them. We need to protect them, and so we need nuclear submarines that have super radar. And so what that they blind the whales so that they are unable to recognize where they are and beach themselves and die by the hundreds. It's our place and we own it. And so civilization has a Jekyll and Hyde capacity. It can turn into an empire where everything is jeopardized, finally, by this tyranny. Or it can mature into a wider civilization where its art becomes differentially capable of showing that there is a further differentiation called the cosmos. And so art leads to the science of the cosmos if it's allowed to be in its natural, in its conscious cycle. And man matures and he's at home in the universe. And so civilizations are one of those watersheds. Not civilization so much, but the control of the mind of civilization is at a watershed where if it doesn't allow its symbols to breathe and to differentiate, to let consciousness have its seasons of maturity, then consciousness in little bits is commandeered by the mind, and mentality asserts its tyranny over everything through making sure that the rituals are what we tell you. The myths are what we will give you, and the symbols are things that we control. The ideas are ours, and we especially are interested in inculcating everyone so that they understand this is how it is. And in all this, more and more, the artificiality and the falsity of such an outlook begins to run against the abrasions of nature and natural change and natural cycles. In the Chinese background, Fuxi and Nugua did not make the I Ching. They made the seeds, the 8 trigrams that became the I Ching. But Fuxi and Nugua are Paleolithic. Not that they are Paleolithic, but they were able to go back to that primordial wilderness, to go back to the wildness. Fuxi is the patron god of hunters in China. His penetration goes back to that threshold where the Neolithic came out of the caves and went to the farmlands. And when one comes out of the caves, if you don't blindly go to the farmlands, what you see for the first time are the stars. And you begin to see that there is a basic transformation that is happening, that the taming is not man's taming the animals and the plants and himself, so much as that man is learning to transform them with a new kind of heavenly indication, heavenly pattern. In China it's called heaven's mandate. So that all the way through, consistent in Chinese civilization, Chinese history, is always the establishment of heaven's mandate. And that this must be renewed each time there is a new cycle, each time there is a new dynasty. Not that they're planning on new dynasties. Every dynasty thought that it was it. Only China has lasted so long, twice as long as ancient Egypt, and recalls and is able to go back and see that heaven's mandate has had to be brought many times. The 2 ceremonies that are a pair, that always are there for the founding of a new great dynasty, the Fangenshui Ceremonies. They used to be performed in Shandong province on Mount Tai, and the emperor himself would go to the top and alone establish the initial seed for heaven's mandate. And then he would bring himself down and he would project out to the kingdom that he has heaven's mandate, and that then what he says to be done, this dynasty then with heaven's mandate, everyone will participate in this celestial constellated patterning of the Neolithic life. And this was foundational in Chinese history, and the first dynasty to bring that into play was the Zhou. The Zhou. And the Joe Dynasty are the ones who made the I Ching. They're the ones who put the trigrams of the Paleolithic into the Neolithic hexagrams. And the Zhou Dynasty, the Zhou people, King Wen and his 3 sons. The oldest son was killed in prison, and the second son became King Wu of the Zhou Dynasty, and the third son was the Duke of Zhou, who was the man first making the commentation on the lines of the hexagrams. His father, King Wen, always portrayed with his wife. So like Fuxi and Nugua, King Wen and his wife, And out of these two pairs, a Paleolithic pair that founded the trigrams on nature's mysterious cycle, mysterious double cycle, then King Wen and his wife brought it into the Neolithic. And in order to have this Neolithic form, one had a broadcast of heaven's mandate in a new form. And the new form in the Zhou Dynasty was to celebrate through the I Ching, through the establishment of the Zhou Yi. That's what the I Ching is called today, the Zhou Yi, the Book of the Zhou. This founds the Zhou Dynasty. And the patron god of the Zhou Dynasty, Hu Qi, is the god of grain from the far west. So that there is this kind of splendor to the early Zhou people, and one finds it not only in the original I Ching, but one finds it in a book that came out at the same time, the Shi Qing, the Book of Odes, the Book of Songs, the first collection of poetry in Asia, dating from about the same time as the I Ching. And when one reads the Book of Songs or the Book of Odes, you find the celebration of this fresh, original creativity of the Zhou people. That the Zhou people have brought forth a kind of a transformation which is a little different from the way in which the nature had worked previously. Nature previously was based on water, and the Zhou people with their grain and their ability to transform things now is based on turning that water into wine. Of transformation, of fermentation. So that the civilization now is held because it can, from the water, transform it into a form of an alcohol. And just as the primordial solvents are water and fire, a third solvent that now comes into play is alcohol. And not just alcohol for being drunk or for being celebratory, but alcohols are able to dissolve certain minerals, certain vitamins that water doesn't dissolve. There are water-soluble vitamins, but there are vitamins only dissolvable, minerals only dissolvable in alcohols, and you begin to have a whole different echelon of herbal medicine, of chemistry, of celebratory qualities, of life, where it's important not only to have olive oil and grains, but to have wine or beer. In Egypt, they preferred beer. That transform of the fermentation is there in the I Ching. And what the fermentation is in the I Ching is that the trigrams, Paleolithic water, fire nature now becomes transformed to a new level of complexity. It becomes the alcohol of the hexagrams. And the hexagrams are not just 8 times 8, but they form a completely expanded set of possibilities of transform. And in this, a slow decay begins to set in, and the Zhou Dynasty, after several hundred years, begins to decay, and after several hundred years more, the whole sense of China begins to wobble, and the whole Neolithic basis of it begins to go sour. Because it isn't just wine, sometimes it becomes soured wine, old. And it's exactly at that point, about 100 years before politically it's just now called, technically it's still the Zhou Dynasty, it's called the period of warring states, everybody fighting everybody. At that threshold, a new contact with the Paleolithic was necessary, and that new contact with the Paleolithic was Lao Tzu. So that the Tao Te Ching is a tail end of the Neolithic return back to the roots, back to the Paleolithic quality of Fuxi. And so Lao Tzu is mysterious in that he is able to go back and contact the wildness, the wilderness of the Paleolithic mysterious nature. And this is the Tao. And immediately, just as you had with Fuxi, when Fuxi was able to go back and contact the primordial, that was the beginnings of the 5 mythic kings of China that led directly to the establishment of the first dynasty, the Xia. And just as that enlarged kingdom, early dynastic China came out of Fuxi, as soon as you have Lao Tzu, now the time is compressed, and you have, for the very first time, an emergence of what we would recognize as a highly literate, highly symbolic Chinese civilization based on Confucius. Kung Fu Tzu, Master Kung. And you have a whole different quality in Confucian civilization in China. You have a quality which is not the water or the wine, but a second transformation has come in, a distillation, and you have a liqueur. And with Confucius, and we'll come back after the break, we'll see that a whole new quality to the I Ching emerges, the liqueur of the I Ching. Not the trigrams or the hexagrams, but the detailed philosophical commentaries called the 10 Wings. And now, with Confucius, you have not only Fuxi and King Wen, but with Confucius, you now have the I Ching as it comes down to us intact, because the Chinese set up in their civilization very much like the Masoretic text of the Old Testament in Judaism. Our Masoretic text in Judaism is exactly the same to every punctuation mark as it was established at the Council of Jamnia in 90 AD. The I Ching that we have is exactly the same as was established at the beginnings of the Han Dynasty about 220 BC. It's exactly the same. Why? Because it was the textbook that founded the Chinese civil service, and everyone in that dynastic empire sequence had to study it exactly, and you could have commentaries from time to time, but you had to have commentaries on what it was. Just as in rabbinical Judaism, you can have all the negotiation and commentaries you want, but you cannot change the scripture, because it's turned into empire scripture. You cannot tamper with it. One of the great responses to this was a second kind of Taoism, going against the whole grain of the Confucian style, was a Chuangzi. And then when the Han Dynasty made it even worse and turned the civilization of Confucius into the Han Dynasty Empire, a group of some of the finest minds of the time gathered together and produced a book called the Huaihanzi about 130 BC. So we'll come back after the break and we'll take a look at this large pattern. This is a self-portrait by a Maori chief named Tupai Kupa. Herman Melville found it in a book published in 1830 called New Zealanders. And this was the primordial vision for Queequeg in Moby Dick. This is the 150th anniversary edition of Norton's critical edition of Moby Dick. We'll come to Melville in just a moment. In order to, you're okay? In order to help evenly distribute all of the variety of rhythms that this learning cycle has, the deepest one, carrying the base frequency of the entire endeavor, a year-long cycle, an annual cycle. In Paleolithic times, the annual cycle was the deepest bass note in the rhythm of life. And it was the cycle of the year, the annual year, that became the deepest engraving of the ritual cycle. And all ritual cycles of the Paleolithic followed, and all of the Neolithic cycles were annealed to this annual cycle. And the annual cycle always has return built into it. As Shelley says in Ode to the West Wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Or Shakespeare, who said, following even the deepest night is the coming dawn. And so these cycles, the cyclic quality, has been with us since life began on this planet. All life has its cycle. And in the context of planetary integrals, and sometimes there are moon integrals, like Europa and Ganymede and Titan, all have organic life forms that follow the cycle of those bodies. But there is a threshold before us which we have not faced before, which is a new scale. And that is, what are the life cycles for an entire star system? For life that now is at home in a stellar civilization. And all of this is completely new and sometimes radical, and one could liken it to a third transformation. It's not that the water has been fermented into wine and that the wine has been distilled into liquor, but now some super extra transformation is happening that we have not ever seen before. And we don't know exactly what it is. We don't even have a name for it. In mystical ancient times, it was always indicated as the cosmic quality of a third transformation that gives you the vaporization of the liqueur. We're using these year-long readings to establish for ourselves this traditional bass note quality. And there are 3 offerings for each of the 2 years. In this first year, we have Lady Murasaki's Tale of Genji, and we have Homer's The Odyssey, and we have Melville's Moby Dick. These are readings that are meant to be distributed over the entire year. And in our navigation chart for the year, there's never more than 5 or 6 pages at any given time. The purpose is to distribute the reading so that it forms a tapestry which covers not only the entire year, which would be a cycle, which would be a circle, but because of the way in which we're developing it, it has a spherical dimension so that it gives our experience a chance to be distributed spherically. And that spherical distribution of experience has several poignant qualities to it. It's no accident that Shakespeare's company named their theater the Globe, because it was in his time when he was a teenager, that the math was first worked out so that navigation could go over the entire globe. The mathematician who worked that out was John Dee. Before he was an astrologer, he was one of the greatest mathematicians of his day. To be able to compute and to navigate on a trigonometric function of the entire planet was so extraordinary that Dee's book of 1575 was a harbinger of things to come, that we had matured to the point to where we were going to be at home on the entire planet. And the British theme song is, "Hail Britannia, Britain rules the waves. We will never, never, never be slaves." To have the home of the entire globe, the entire planet, and now here in the 21st century we're beginning to realize that our new home is 3 billion miles in diameter. And its sphere is so large that it takes light almost entire season to just go across it. And so the scale of our life, of our practical being, is so enormous and the transforms are so complex that we have to go back and touch the Paleolithic again. We have to go back and touch the primordial, and that's why these presentations are oral. With all kinds of written adjuncts and many other qualities and transforms that are put in, but not allowing for the mind's powerful symbolic ideas to dominate. If you notice, the I Ching is not presented with any diagrams. There are no metaphysical systems. China is full of diagrams and metaphysical systems on the I Ching. When the Sung Dynasty came into play, its use of the I Ching was so radical with Neo-Confucianism that it was almost impossible for people who were intellectuals in the Sung to give any credit at all to anyone who had ever lived before. They were naive to an extent of being ridiculous. And when the Sung Dynasty fell and the Yuan Dynasty, Genghis Khan, the Mongols, came in and took over China, they knew nothing at all about the I Ching. Their sense of divination was to send a Mongol horde and kill all life so that it would be absolutely free land so that the next generation of Mongols could come and set up whatever they wanted to. But fortunately, China civilized the sons, and Kublai Khan became interested in a few things, and out of the Yuan came a new dimension of China that had never been there before: plays. All the great early plays in China come from the Yuan Dynasty, because it was the only way to get across to the Mongols that there is a sophistication, a subtlety to life. They couldn't see it themselves, but they could see it in these court dramas that on the surface were very much like the complications of Kalidasa in India or the complications of Plautus in Rome. But slowly, as the Yuan Dynasty in its turn fell, the next dynasty that came back was so traditionally Chinese that they call themselves the Ming, meaning the bright, the brilliant. We are back. And in the Ming, you find for the first time the great Chinese novels. All the great Chinese literary masterpieces, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, all of them are Ming novels. But we're looking at a China which is very ancient by that time. I remember about 20 years ago of wanting to present some Tang poetry the Tang poetry of the 700s AD. And I had to search all over California and finally found Professor Orient Lee in San Diego, who was able to read Tang poetry out loud in a medieval Chinese intonation. One has to be extremely erudite. No one knows how to read Lao Tzu out loud. No one knows how to read Confucius out loud. We don't know the Chinese of that era very well at all. In fact, the characters appear here at the top row, and these are the kind of characters you would have about 200 years after Confucius, about 300 years after Lao Tzu, about the time of Chuang-Tzu. And the second row are the Chinese characters that came in with the Han Dynasty, and they were used right up to 1911, unchanged. Empires specialize in keeping their control by not letting anything really change and keeping everything seemingly in its concourse, so that you're well behaved as long as you fit in with the general swirl, which the paddle of that swirl is held by those who have it. No one has any idea about Fuxi. When you go back 2,500 years before Confucius, no one knows what that is. And to pretend to have diagrams and to think that Han Dynasty or Qin Dynasty metaphysics of yin-yang is going to satisfy in style even what the I Ching was in the Joe Dynasty is foolishness, much less to go back to its primordiality. This was apparent by 500 BC, and that's where Lao Tzu comes in. Lao Tzu saw that the Neolithic I Ching overlay, which had for about 600 or 700 years by that time had founded China in the sense of its reality of life, was not only suspect and tattered, but that it was artificial beyond belief. And so Lao Tzu goes back to the primordial. He recontacts that Paleolithic primordiality. And though he was the most literate figure of his day, he was the archivist for the Imperial Library. He was the most well-read, literate man of his day. He wrote nothing. The Tao Te Ching is delivered orally. At the very end of his life, at the cusp, like those Paleolithic caves where the last little bit of daylight that one can see, that's where the art images began. Lao Tzu, just as he was writing out of China forever, he was old, proverbially 200 years old, which means that he was at least in his 90s. Traditionally, the image of him is riding an ox, but he's not riding an ox to plow any land. He's riding a wild ox without a saddle going into the wilderness of the far west, because in China, like in ancient Egypt, the paradise was the wilderness of the far west, which led into the beatific realms of the wondrous, of the ancient Paleolithic wildness and wilderness of the world. And there, at that high pass where the Yellow River, the Huang Ho, comes down and makes a big right-handed curve, because the rock abutments and the mountain ranges are so massive there, and the Yellow River comes down and makes a right-angled turn and goes out all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, long, long way away. There is a pass, it's called the Hankou Pass. And you go through that pass and you're now in western China. The Wei River comes down through there. And there's where Chang'an and the far west, and even beyond that 1,000 miles, one has the threshold to the Gobi Desert, and Beyond that, who knows what vastnesses there were. Lao Tzu was going that way, and the keeper of the Hankou Pass asked for him to leave something, and the Tao Te Ching is his verbal, oral cascade of primordiality, which the keeper of the past writes down. And the keeper of the past, and this is a great theme in the world. When Vyasa was composing the Mahabharata, in his lifetime was the first time that Sanskrit was written down. Up until then, everything was always oral. And so Vyasa shows us at the beginning of the Mahabharata that he does not write the Mahabharata down, but he has an amanuensis, a scribe, who is the god, the elephant god, Ganesha of all figures. Good luck, prosperity, and it's Ganesha who writes down the Mahabharata. Vyasa delivers it orally, like Lao Tzu delivering it orally. It is the oral presentation that is characteristic of the Neolithic, but it is the way in which it is heard within one's, not experience, and not mind, but heard within one's spirit. And it is in that spirit that the Paleolithic has its concourse of wild naturality. And so when one sees the Tao Te Ching right away, one is told that it isn't about a written symbolic formulation, nor is it purely about an oral mythic flow, but it is something that is deeper than that, that goes back to the mysterious. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. That name may be the mother of the 10,000 things, but there's something more primordial than that. And so Lao Tzu goes back to that. And just as Fu Xi, who went back to the primordial, back to the Paleolithic, and right away you get a new level of civilization. Right away after Lao Tzu, a whole new level of civilization occurs. Confucian China, the Lunyu, the Analects. And Confucius, in order to save the tradition, adds to it. And in adding to it, that addition is not just added to it, but it goes into a deep transform of everything that was there. And you get a completely new I Ching. You get the I Ching that we are familiar with, which is the seed of Fu Xi, nourished by King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, critically illuminated by Lao Tzu, and then reformed by Confucius into the I Ching that we recognize today. And yet that Confucian civilization of the I Ching, within a couple of hundred years, within 250 years, turned into a tyranny. One of the strictest tyrannies in world history. When Qin Shi Huang Ti took over China, he changed it so that everyone is named after him. You are now all mine. You are Chinese. Qin, Chinese. You belong to me. And in order to assert his power, he made the Great Wall of China. And when he was buried in his tomb, he redid the entire cosmos. His entire army was done in sculptures, 8,000 life-size figures, all buried with him to protect him, because he, like all tyrants, I am here permanently. You cannot get away from my authority. And yet, there is a response to that of freedom that does not come out of ideology. Reality, when it is free, is wild and not ideological. So it offers no argument. It offers a deeper transformation. And the deeper transformation against the tyranny that came up Qin Shi Huang Ti, being a man, finally died. But the people who came and took his show over, the Han Dynasty, said, we are here, and no matter who dies, we have plenty of family members. There will always be a Han emperor. Han Wu Ti, about 140 BC, had 130,000 people on his staff, and their only concern was to do what he wanted, to make sure that what he wanted got distributed and done everywhere in China. No exceptions. And when Han Wu Ti was promulgating at the height of his world, the greatest historian in China was born, Sima Qian. And it's Sima Qian and his great father, who are the first time that one has the kind of history that one would recognize from Thucydides and from Herodotus, from Tacitus, and one finds in Sima Qian the great multi-volume records of how civilization must have an ability to have a historical touch to primordiality. Otherwise, it becomes mind-bound. It becomes intellectually sour. It becomes a mental projection of empire alone and has no livingness to it. And at the very same time, one finds the development in China of the Huaihanzi, great translation of it from Hong Kong University Press by Charles LeBlanc. Chapter 11 of it was translated by the University of Hawaii Press, and it's called The Art of Rulership, a study in ancient Chinese political thought, Roger Ames. The art of rulership, that empire authority is unreal. What is real is not political control over mental forms, but that there is a further development of the art of the civilization. And that ruling it is not being a ruler, but making sure that the mandate of heaven and the fertility of man and the original quality of the earth all have access to each other. That the cycle, the concourse, is not just the seasons, but the energy. And one finds that, especially there in Lao Tzu, because the cycle is a 5-phase energy cycle, with the Tao originating it not as one, but originating it as 0. And because the Tao is 0, that means then that Te, the unity of existence, is really one. Its oneness is not a oneness imposed by the mind, by some integral doctrine principle. It emerges that way. It emerges whole. So that because Te is whole and because Tao is empty, it means that when they swirl together, when the ones and zeros swirl together, that then you have a pair which is from the Te standpoint 2, but from the Tao standpoint comes clean. It doesn't leave any trace and goes on further. So that the third phase in the energy cycle, Tao, Te, Gen. And because Gen, as that third cycle, is not just 3, but it's really 2, because it's 0 and 1 together as a set, as a pair, Gen has the capacity to be fertile, to go both back into the earth and to go onward into heaven. And so for the first time one can say, it's a Chinese proverb, man is the bridge between heaven and earth. But not so much bridge. We would understand it in our time. Our English word for it would be membrane. That human life is the membrane that allows for cells to be cells, but allows for energy and nutrition and neural impulses to go through. Membranes are not walls. And they allow for an interface of two qualities that are seemingly polarized. Every cell and every organic organism in the universe has a fundamental beginning. The two sides of the membrane of cellular life in the universe, one side is water loving and the other side is water avoiding. And the hydrophilic quality of the membrane allows for osmosis to come in, but there's a way to close off most of it and just leave channels open so that the cell can have its form. So that cytoplasm doesn't just blur, but really has a form. That the cell nucleus, the mitochondria, all of that have their places, and yet they're places that are accessible. Usually the energy channels that are there initially in cell membranes are from calcium, or sometimes sodium or potassium. Those ionic channels, they're thresholds. It's like the Hankou Pass was an ionic channel for Lao Tzu to orally deliver the Tao Te Ching, not in a written form, and deeper than an oral form, in that primordial, mysterious, not form, but process, so that the Tao Te Ching in its original had no punctuation, none whatsoever. It was what we would call, in logic today, a cascade. A cascade of 5,500 words, Chinese words, characters, and part of the paradox is that in the 1930s and 40s, the standard vocabulary for Chinese was called Fen's 5,000, published by Harvard University Press. That if you had mastered these 5,000 Chinese characters, you would be able to at least read Chinese newspaper and carry on conversations for all normal life. But Lao Tzu's 5,000 was not at all like Fen's 5,000. It was not an academic vocabulary that fed a grammar which was logical and a syntax which was under control. Lao Tzu and his Tao Te Ching is specifically always wild. Even when he is making the most sense, he's making a sense in allowing spaces and holes to occur where they really do. And one finds that in language, in modern linguistics, in the way in which we understand how language works, all languages have spaces where you cannot say in the normal language anything at all. Sometimes there are time tenses, sometimes there are other qualities, and we'll go into it a little bit later. One of the very best books on the Chinese language, Fact and Fantasy, John DeFrancis, has a whole book on the misunderstandings that academics and metaphysicians and tyrants and political economy buffs always impose upon culture and language and people in life. And it's only when you begin to look at these things in a very deep way does one come to understand there are many, many qualities here. One of the earliest monographs, Sound and Symbol in Chinese by Bernard Karlgren, professor of sinology, University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Karlgren's the one who did the great edition of the Book of Odes back quite a long ways away from us in time. There are many other things, language and culture. This is a monograph of the American Anthropological Association 50 years ago, 1954. And at that time, Benjamin Whorf's theories of language were primordial in the world of consideration at the time. Language, Thought, and Reality by Whorf. And there's a whole section here on Chinese versus English, an exploration of the Whorfian thesis, of ways in which it's very mysterious how Chinese and English have a lot of similarities in that the wholes in discourse are put to poetic use. Chinese and English poetry both have this ability to say the ineffable without saying it, but allowing for the arrangement of what can be said in such a way that it is perforated by energy channels of spirit. The most succinct way of ever talking about it was Dylan Thomas. He said one time about poetry, he said, "Good poetry is not a wall of meaning, but has all the nicks and chinks in it to allow the lightning and thunder to come through." Not only do not go gentle into that good night, do not get walled up in the tomb that Edgar Allan Poe wrote about. There is a quality in Confucius which to the Taoists of the Han Dynasty of the Huainanzu, Prince Luan was of the royal family. He could have been emperor under certain circumstances, but he brought together a group of about 30 people that met at his house and who were trying to contact the Paleolithic, the primordial, again, because Confucian civilization had run across the same thing that Joe Neolithic and the old Paleolithic had all run against, and that was that it keeps integrating. It keeps integrating, and if it isn't opened up by recontacting the primordial and opening up the differential consciousness so it can flourish, then it seals itself off and regresses, and the regression is on every level, and the biggest regression is that civilization becomes an empire. And empires have a way of tightening their control until everything is under control. And if you buck us, we take you out. Genghis Khan was the ultimate hero of the most efficient way to ensure that your empire will survive. There's no one around to contest it. The difficulty is that Genghis Khan's golden hordes didn't just kill all the people, they killed all the animals, all the birds, all the plants, and they left Central Asia a wasteland even till today. Here from the Huainanzu, translation by Evan Morgan from Shanghai in the 1930s, called Tao the Great Luminant. Not all of the Huainanzu, it was just about 2/3 of it. The concord of the inner life is gagged. The affections and nature of life are under bondage to these conventional rules of life. The whole of existence is burdened by such restrictions as these. But the man who is enlightened in the Tao is not so. He regulates his natural passions and controls the activities of the emotions. He nourishes them with the harmony of life and maintains them by suitable processes. The person who delights in the Tao forgets his mean position, and he who finds rest in virtue does not think of poverty. Whilst his nature has no illicit desire, there is no desire that is ungratified. While his heart is not given to sensual pleasure, there is no true joy he doesn't possess. So that the five-phase energy cycle, which was there in Lao Tzu and freshened in Chuang Tzu, becomes exfoliated into a whole bouquet in the Huainanzu. Lao Tzu at 500 BC, Chuang Tzu 350 BC, the Huainanzu at 130 BC. So that by the time that you have the high point of the early Han imperial empire control. Han Wuti's empire spread from the Atlantic Ocean to all the way to Afghanistan already, from Siberia all the way down to Indochina. China again would not be that large until the Tang Dynasty of Tang Taizong, some 900 years later. All the time, the I Ching was undergoing a reverberation of renewal, because each time that this was renewed, the time was shortened. So that in between Lao Tzu and his contacting the primordial and Confucius setting up a whole new civilization was only about 50 years. And when you come around 350 BC to the Yin-Yang Chia, the Yin-Yang school of interpreting the I Ching. Oh no, it's not Tao Te, it's Yin-Yang. And because it's polarized, and because we can make all kinds of dualistic diagrams with polarities, this is how it's going to be. The immediate response was Chuangzi, who contacted the primordial within a year of that. And in the early chapters of the Chuangzi, you have the origin, the seed that later became Zen. And he's the one who says, there's a great, huge bird so vast that it flaps its wings once, and it flies 100,000 li. And all the little sparrows hopping in the bushes say, that can't possibly be real. None of us can fly even over one of these trees, much less 100,000 li. It must be fictitious. It's all made up. It isn't real. And then Chuangzi says, I'm like that great bird who, having flown south for a while, will now fly north. And so you get this agility of the liqueur, of the fermentation of Lao Tzu brought into this very fine cognac. And then the Huainan Tzu is a distribution of Chuangzi's cognac into a communion of transformation of a whole new sense of community. And out of the Huainan Tzu came all of the socialist Taoist communities that would surface when the Han Dynasty fell. And at one time, more than a third of China was already wild families and communities of people in the mountains all over China who are under no one's control. Thoreau in the United States is like one of those figures, like in the Huainan Tzu, who was able to go back to primordiality and to take a cue from those figures who had come before, and to present it in such a way that his influence suddenly was transforming everything. His influence, not like the influence of Emerson, of making groups of people who would form little institutions. Here's the Bronson Alcott's chapel in Concord, the Concord School of Philosophy, and here's the interior. Thoreau helped him build it. It isn't just that. They also built this little temple that was a Nepalese Buddhist temple in Massachusetts. They also set up a whole community called Fruitlands, which was a farming utopia community, very much like Brook Farm. But Thoreau went deeper than these kinds of things. He brought the primordiality of being in nature in a Paleolithic way back to everyone who would ever read him. And so he distributed himself like a Paleolithic evaporative essence of the cognac, of deeper transforms than any empire could ever corral, and gave it to whoever would contact him. More next week.